Hey guys, tonight we begin on a vast sweep of grassland where the sky is so big it almost feels like it's judging you. The wind runs wild, unbothered by borders, and the only things faster than the breeze are the hooves of horses and the stomachs of the postal riders, balanced on top of them. We're heading deep into the Mongol Empire, but not to watch battles or hear about conquests. No, tonight we're squinting into the saddlebags of messengers, poking around the bottom of leather lunch pouches and asking the real questions like, why does everything smell faintly of goat? It was a hard life, galloping across thousands of miles of steppe, bearing royal decrees and the occasional passive-aggressive letter from one cousin governor to another. You might imagine a glorious saddle and eagle overhead, and the romantic rustle of silk banners in the wind. But more often it was wind-burned cheeks, lukewarm milk that had fermented 3 times before noon, and a stew that somehow managed to be both undercooked and burnt. You probably wouldn't survive this job, to be honest. Most wouldn't. The horses were better trained than the men. The roads didn't exist. The pay was rarely worth the saddle sores. And the lunch? Oh, the lunch. Well, that's what we're here to talk about. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you know. Also, let me know in the comments where and when you're listening from. Are you curled up in bed on a long drive through foggy hills, or halfway through a midnight snack that's hopefully not made of boiled horse sinew? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Mongol steppe had a sound, not just the wind or the hooves or the yipping of distant foxes. It was the sound of something always on the move, something hungry in every sense of the word. The messengers of the Yam, the Mongol imperial postal system, were constantly in motion on horseback, always with a destination, usually with a growling stomach. These riders leaned sun-scorched, wrapped in layers of wool and leather, were the arteries of the empire, and their lunch habits reflected a diet designed for endurance, not delight. Take Bold Bayar, for example, not a real man, but certainly a real type. He's galloping westward with an urgent message in his satchel and a pouch tied to his belt. Inside the pouch, a wad of dried curds, so sour they could strip the enamel off your dreams, a few slivers of salted horse meat, and a flask of arag or fermented mare's milk that had been shaken into a froth by the relentless jostling of the ride. He'll chew as he rides, swallow without stopping, and occasionally belch so violently it scares the horses. Sometimes Bold Bayer dreams of stew. Not a good stew. No one on the steppe has ever made a truly good stew, but a warm one shared at a roadside Urtu station with onions if he's lucky, and goat fat glistening just under the surface. It's the kind of meal that soaks into your bones, the kind that doesn't taste better the more you eat it, but which at least reminds you you're still alive. Historians still argue whether the Mongol postal riders were given food stipends or if they were expected to fend for themselves at each station. Some say the stations were well stocked, full of roasted meats and thick broths. Others suggest a more grim picture: thin, gruel-stale cheese and meat that had been drying since the last eclipse. But one thing is certain: whatever they ate, it had to be fast. These were not leisurely banquets. Meals were scarfed down in minutes, often standing, often with one hand still on the reins. Napkins were a dream. Cutlery, a distant legend. You used your fingers or the blade of your belt knife or the horn spoon passed down from some long-dead uncle who once claimed to wrestle wolves. The food itself was a marvel of adaptation. Everything had to travel well. It had to last in saddlebags. It had to survive heat, cold, and the occasional nibbling by curious goats. Mongol cuisine therefore leaned heavily on preservation, drying, salting, fermenting, smoking. A courier's lunch was less a meal and more a rugged survival kit made of protein and spite. And yet there was variety, if not in flavor, then in texture. A ride across the Altai might yield a bit of smoked yak. A stop near the Orkhon River could include freshwater fish jerky, desiccated to the point of crunch. One lucky visit to a richer station might even provide a stuffed dumpling or something resembling a pancake, though by the time it reached the rider's hands, it was often stiffer than the scroll he carried. There were customs, too. Riders were known to offer bits of their meal to household spirits when staying at a stranger's yurt. They might murmur a few words to the stew pot, not prayers exactly, but bargains. Don't give me food. Poisoning is a sentiment that transcends cultures. In the evenings, if time allowed, meals were shared among riders. Stories would flow exaggerated with each sip of fermented milk, and old bards might emerge from under blankets to hum low tunes about the time the stew walked off on its own legs. Laughter would rise into the cold night air, chased by the scent of boiling goat, and one by one the riders would fall asleep, full-bellied, dust-covered, and dreaming of food they would never quite get to taste. Tomorrow they'd ride again. And tomorrow's lunch, probably the same as today's, possibly slightly older. The thing about organizing a postal system across the largest contiguous land empire in history is that you need a lot of horses and even more paranoia. The Yam Genghis Khan's great imperial courier network wasn't just a line of sweaty messengers galloping between yurts. It was a logistical feat so wildly ambitious it bordered on absurd. Imagine trying to connect Korea to Hungary using nothing but ponies' yurts and the occasional stale dumpling. Then imagine trying to feed all the people doing it without having them drop dead halfway through the Gobi. From the outside it looked seamless. A message dispatched from Karakorum, the Mongol capital, could arrive in Bukhara days later, passed hand to hand by dozens of riders, each changing horses at designated Urtu stations, spaced roughly every 25 to 30 miles. The system worked with terrifying efficiency, especially if you were the unlucky soul on the receiving end of a message beginning with, "By order of the Great Khan." But internally, it was pure steaming chaos in a goatskin pouch. Every relay station required staff horsekeepers, cooks, letter checkers, stew stirrers. Some doubled as inns, some barely passed as windbreaks. The infrastructure ran on loyalty duty and just the right amount of fear, because nothing motivated a Mongol official like the distant, ever-watching eye of the Khan and the quiet possibility of public disembowelment for failure. Naturally, this encouraged a brisk work ethic. Yet what's often overlooked in all this grand imperial design is what the couriers themselves carried besides messages, specifically lunch. Feeding the messengers was more than a practical concern. It was a matter of imperial stability. A hungry rider was a slow rider, and a slow rider meant delayed decrees, unanswered summons, and whole villages confused about whether they were supposed to be celebrating a wedding or preparing for a siege. So Genghis Khan, who despite his many faults understood supply chains better than most medieval rulers, decreed that Urtu stations be stocked with food as well as horses. Now, stocked is a generous word. The supplies were minimal, bland, and more or less based on the availability of livestock that hadn't already been turned into belts. Most stations relied on whatever the locals could spare: strips of dried mutton, dusty wheels of curd, and sometimes, if the timing was just right, a hot pot of stew bubbling over a dung fire. The stew was always questionable. It contained meat, certainly. What kind of meat? That was often more of a philosophical question than a culinary one. Historians still argue whether there was an official menu across the yam stations. Some believe there were standardized rations, chunks of meat, measured by weight, curds by number, and milk by the gurgle. Others claim it was a patchwork, with some stations serving almost gourmet fare by 13th century nomadic standards, and others providing little more than boiled bark and the vague scent of soup. There's one dubious account, probably apocryphal, of a rider who arrived at a station only to find the cook had mistaken horse glue for broth. That man, the tale insists, could whistle without moving his lips for the rest of his life. More certain is the fact that yam couriers learned to eat defensively. Meals were taken quickly and strategically, often just before saddling up again, to avoid the unpleasant sensation of fermented mare's milk sloshing against one's spleen mid-gallop. A common tactic was to wrap a hunk of meat in cloth and tuck it near the armpit for warmth. By the time the rider dismounted at the next station, it would be just warm enough to be edible, or at least soft enough to chew without cracking a tooth. It also allowed the food to acquire a certain aroma, a bold blend of man-mutton and the existential dread of being late. And yet there were culinary innovations. Riders developed techniques for keeping cheese from crumbling into dust. They learned which parts of a goat could survive 3 days in a saddlebag without offending the ancestors. Some even created saddle-shaped lunch trays, wooden slats, tied to the side of the horse that could hold food upright as they rode, though these were generally regarded as both genius and deeply uncool. But food wasn't just for survival, it was also for status. Higher-ranking messengers might receive better fare, real dumplings, honey cakes, sometimes even tea. And those who carried messages from the great Khan himself, they could demand food from anyone they encountered. Local farmers, herders, even passing monks were required to feed them. It was written in imperial law, and nothing ruins a monk's quiet afternoon like having to scramble together a stew for a man with 3 scrolls, 6 knives, and no discernible sense of gratitude. These elite riders were also allowed to take extra portions, which led to no small amount of jealousy among their peers. There's even one recorded squabble documented in a stew-stained margin where a lower courier accused his superior of hoarding dumplings. It escalated into a brief shouting match, then a wrestling match, then a very awkward dinner where they both had to eat the same pot of goat elbows in complete silence. Still, the system worked, miraculously. The yam allowed the Mongol Empire to maintain control over a realm that stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, all while ensuring the meat stayed vaguely warm and the milk, at the very least, didn't explode. As for Bold Bayar, yes, him again, he's currently trotting into the next station. His airag is half gone. His curd orb has been nibbled by something with tiny teeth. He hands over the message with the weary dignity of a man who's both proud and profoundly gassy. Tomorrow he'll do it all again. And lunch, it'll be waiting. Somewhere between a culinary insult and a survival mechanism, just the way the Khan liked it. The Mongols, for all their thunderous cavalry charges and wide-reaching ambitions, were at heart practical people. They understood a simple truth. one that even emperors sometimes forget. An empire runs not just on blood and iron, but on stomachs. You see, a starving postal worker doesn't deliver royal commands with much enthusiasm, nor does he outrun bandits, cross half-frozen rivers, or avoid wolves while contemplating the deeper meaning of a hardened cheese lump rattling in his pocket. So it quickly became apparent to Genghis Khan's planners, who were surprisingly good at bureaucracy, considering how often they burned libraries, that feeding the couriers was not just a courtesy. It was a matter of imperial survival. Unlike the well-fed scribes who sat cross-legged in palaces comparing tax ledgers, or the generals who roasted full sheep over roaring fires while planning their next conquest, the yam messengers often lived off scraps. But not just any scraps, carefully calculated ones. Historians still argue whether there was an official ration standard, or if the food was simply whatever the local herder hadn't already fed to his favorite cousin. Some surviving Mongol ordinances suggest a quota of meat, cheese, and milk provided to riders at each urtu, but archaeological digs at these way stations tend to uncover more evidence of hasty improvisation than grand menu planning. Bone fragments, bits of charred grain, and something one team identified only as potentially edible. But there's one item that shows up again and again: mutton. Boiled, roasted, sun-dried, salted, sometimes aged beneath a saddle. Mutton was the reigning monarch of the Mongol pantry. Not because it was particularly delicious, though if you were cold enough and tired enough, anything could be, but because sheep were everywhere. Portable, plentiful, and only mildly vindictive. They made the perfect mobile meat unit. Goats too were popular, though more ornery. Their meat was gamier, their milk stronger, and their personalities uncooperative. There's a story passed down in the sleepy gossip of border posts about a goat named Sogtu, who became so infamous for biting couriers that one station allegedly made him the official stew taster. No one knows what happened to Sogtu, but to this day some riders still mutter, "Don't let it Sogtu," when a stew starts bubbling suspiciously fast. Now meals themselves were not elaborate affairs. Most consisted of a one-pot dish known as shul, a thin meat broth, flavored by whatever happened to be lying around, including dried onions, root vegetables, rare and celebrated, and the occasional crushed seed or spice, if the station happened to be near a caravan route. The smell was unmistakable, a soft haze of boiled protein and hope. Riders would squat around the pot, dipping wooden ladles or spoons made from antler into the steaming liquid. Bread was a luxury, rice an exotic rumor, and fruit something you only saw in paintings or dreams. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone would produce a hunk of hardened honey cake or a pinch of wild herbs, and for a fleeting moment the postal network tasted almost festive. It was not uncommon for riders to add small tokens to their food: a scrap of fabric from a loved one, a sliver of bone from a lucky rabbit, or even a polished stone said to ensure safe passage. Not to eat, of course. These were charms, small gestures of superstition against the dangers of the road. The Mongols were pragmatic warriors, yes, but also deeply spiritual nomads, with a belief that the land watched and remembered. One lesser-known tradition involved whispering to your food. Couriers would lean over the pot and murmur requests: "Don't let me get sick," or "Keep the wolves away tonight." It sounds strange, but when your entire job involves racing across 5,000 miles of unpredictable weather and occasional banditry, it makes sense to hedge your bets even with your lunch. And yet, for all the hardship, the riders took a certain pride in their routines. They'd trade stories about which station served the greasiest goat who still used real onions, and which cook once added too much salt and caused 3 riders to fall asleep mid-message. They made it, eventually. There was also a curious custom of ranking urtu stews, unofficially. Riders kept mental lists: best stew east of the Altai, most likely to contain horsetail soup that once screamed. These rankings were passed on in murmurs, scratched onto saddles, or grumbled between bites. Woe to the station whose stew received the dreaded designation, tastes like revenge. Still, the system, for all its culinary quirks, worked, because the riders, hard men and women with dust-caked boots and eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon, understood the deal. They would carry news across the known world. They would endure frostbite boredom and gastrointestinal mystery. And in return, they asked only this: something warm in their bellies, something dry in their saddlebags, and a little less goat in the stew this time. Tonight, in your mind's eye, picture one such rider huddled by a low fire at a wind-swept station. The stew pot bubbles, the stars wheel overhead. A dog snores nearby, curled around a saddlebag. The rider chews slowly, not because the food is good, but because there's nowhere else to be right now. And with a spoon in one hand and a scroll in the other, he sighs the eternal sigh of all Mongol couriers past and future. Well, at least it's hot. Somewhere between the Tool River and the Altai foothills, a rider named Bold Bayar reached into his satchel and pulled out what could generously be described as lunch. Less generously, it resembled a regrettable accident wrapped in goat skin. He gave it a sniff. It did not return the favor. Inside was the usual fare: a puck of dry cheese, hard enough to repel arrows, a handful of shredded meat that might have once been yak, but was now mostly philosophical in texture, and a lump of something sticky that might have started as dumpling and ended as mystery. The Mongol Postal satchel was a curious thing. Equal parts communications hub and portable pantry, with one side holding the fate of provinces and the other holding lunch, if you were lucky. To understand the daily grind of a Mongol courier, one must understand the role of the satchel. This was no mere bag. It was sacred. On one end, a carefully wrapped scroll, bearing the seal of the great Khan, orders to governors, messages to generals, reports on rebellious nobles. On the other end, a cloth bundle of survival food charms and the occasional slightly crushed gift from home, like a dried apricot or a pebble with emotional significance. Lunch was usually stored in pouches, skin flasks, or small wooden boxes tied shut with horsehair. These were meant to keep food separate from correspondence, though accidents happened. One unfortunate report to the Khan arrived in Karakoram with faint stains and a smell that suggested it had been folded beside boiled onions for several days. The scribe tasked with reading it fainted midway through and had to be revived with sour milk and slaps. Historians still argue whether the Mongols had a standardized way to store meals during courier trips. Some believe there was an official lunch pouch, designed leather, on the outside wool-lined inside, with compartments for meat, curd, and liquids. Others think riders improvised using whatever fabric bark or goat stomach they had on hand. At least one discovered satchel appeared to have been made from woven horsehair and smelled so strongly of mare's milk that the excavation team politely declined further study. Boldbuyer, for his part, had developed a technique: wrap the meat in oiled cloth, store the cheese in a hollowed bone, and keep the airag upright with a spoon wedged just so. It was a balancing act like carrying soup on a trampoline, And then there was the meat jelly. Yes, meat jelly, called kultsun ma, or more dramatically unholy meat pudding by a traveling Persian merchant. This dish was made by boiling animal parts until the natural gelatin congealed. It could be set in a bowl or shaped like a loaf, and it traveled well because it had the texture of guilt and refused to spoil out of pure stubbornness. Riders would slice off hunks and chew slowly like people trying to swallow their decisions. What's often forgotten is that these meals weren't just fuel, they were comfort, or at least a sort of grim reassurance. In the middle of a vast, mostly empty empire, on a horse you barely knew, with wolves howling in the distance, and the constant suspicion that you'd taken a wrong turn somewhere around the last sacred rock lunch was the one thing you could count on, even if it was awful. Sometimes, though, there were surprises. An Urtu station might have fresh broth waiting, or a relative of a courier might pack a treat smoked fish from the Onon River, sweet curds flavored with wild mint, or a roll of dried berries that stuck to your teeth like familial love. Riders hoarded these like treasure rationing bites for the long miles ahead. One documented case describes a man who saved a honey pastry for 7 days, only to find it eaten by his horse in a moment of inattention. The horse apparently showed no remorse. And of course, there were the lunch-related disasters. One legendary tale tells of a young courier named Odd who mistook a lump of hardened meat jelly for his ink block. He dipped his brush into it, wrote out 3 royal decrees, and handed them off with great pride. By the time the scrolls reached their destination, they had attracted every ant in the province and had to be interpreted between bites. The orders were ultimately obeyed, but one governor insisted that the scent of goat haunted his office for years. There was also the matter of temperature. Riders crossing the Gobi faced frozen rations that required thawing by body heat, usually under the armpit or thigh. The result, meals that were technically warm but emotionally scarring. In contrast, couriers in the southern plains dealt with over-fermented cheese, reheated 3 times by the sun and once by accident when left near a forge. That cheese was said to hum softly if held close. Still, the satchel remained sacred. Riders guarded it more fiercely than their own limbs. It was common to sleep with it, clutched under one arm, like a pillow full of secrets and mutton. There's a folk saying, still whispered in some Ger camps, trust your horse with your life, your satchel with your death. Bold Bayer understood this. So when his meat jelly leaked into a decree ordering tax reforms in Samarkand, he did the only thing he could. He wiped it off with a piece of his sleeve, reheated the jelly over a low fire, and ate it in silence. Because after all, scrolls could be recopied. Lunch could not. By midday, the sun over the steppe was less pleasantly warm and more enthusiastic punishment baking both man and beast in its relentless glare. Dust clung to the inside of every nostril, and the wind tasted faintly of hooves. Bold Bayar, rattling along atop his endlessly hungry horse, reached for the small flask tied securely to his saddle. He popped the cork, tipped it back, and let the familiar fizz of arag bubble across his tongue like a sour lightning bolt. Ah, yes, fermented mare's milk. The beverage of champions, or more precisely, the beverage of people with limited options and very forgiving stomachs. Arag, known in other places as kumis, was the lifeblood of the Mongol rider. It was milk from a mare left to ferment in a leather sack, then churned vigorously until the mixture achieved a state of both drinkability and mild existential alarm. Slightly alcoholic, always fizzy, and prone to explode if shaken too much. which on horseback was inevitable. Arag was equal parts refreshment and digestive dare. The first time a rider drank it, tradition held that they should grimace politely and pretend it wasn't like drinking vinegar stirred with hay. After that, it was just part of the routine. Morning ride Arag, afternoon lull Arag, midnight wolf attack narrowly avoided definitely Arag. Historians still argue whether the daily consumption of Arag was nutritionally necessary or just culturally inevitable. On the one hand, it provided essential calories, some hydration, and just enough alcohol to take the edge off galloping into snowstorms. On the other, it had a shelf life of about 3 hours once opened, and frequently caused what scholars have diplomatically described as sudden gastrointestinal developments. There are multiple records of postal riders arriving at a station with the scroll perfectly intact and their pants in a state of profound betrayal. This gave rise to a secondary tradition: never trust Arag after noon. By that point, the sun had had its say, the fermentation process had turned belligerent, and the mixture could be classified as weaponized yogurt. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, riders were fiercely loyal to their fermented friend. Some even developed rituals. One man famously would knock on the flask before drinking, as if warning the spirits inside. Another courier was said to whisper apologies to the mare that had produced the milk, though this may have had more to do with a prior incident involving a poorly timed kick and a regrettable love poem. Arag wasn't the only dairy oddity packed into the postal rider's diet. There were also milk curds, arul, which came in hard, jagged chunks that could last for years without changing in texture or taste, mostly because they started out as something between chalk and shame. These were often sweetened slightly, though sweet in the Mongol steppe sense meant no longer punishing. Riders would gnaw on them thoughtfully, like philosophers, with jaw fatigue, and then chase it down with another swig of Arag. Of course, not all milk was mare's milk. Cow's milk was sometimes used, as was goat's, though neither carried the same social significance. Mare's milk, after all, came from the beloved horses, those divine four-legged engines of empire. It was believed to carry the essence of speed, stamina, and just enough chaos to keep things interesting. There was a moment every courier dreaded, however, when the Arag went off. And we don't mean fermented off. That part was expected. We mean off, the kind where the smell curls your eyebrows and the taste makes your ancestors cough. You could tell by the sound it made when the flask was shaken. If it sloshed like soup, you were probably safe. If it gurgled like a wounded goat, well, best not to tempt fate. One station kept a chalkboard tally of how many riders had fallen to rogue Arag. It wasn't official, of course, and it wasn't mentioned in any administrative records, but the cook there liked to mark a tiny hoofprint every time someone sprinted to the dung heap in distress. It is said that one summer, the hoofprints outnumbered the actual meals served. Still, Arag remained the drink of choice. It was portable, it was symbolic, and if consumed carefully, it kept the belly calm and the spirits high. Riders even developed a technique for storing it upright in the saddle, a small netted pouch hanging under the armpit, tied close to the body for warmth and to prevent excessive sloshing. Bold buyers swore by this method. Others preferred strapping it to the saddle horn, where it jiggled like a warning. There are even poems, yes, poems, about Arag. One anonymous composition, discovered etched into the side of a wooden flask, reads, "O sacred milk, whose song is fizz, whose truth lies deep in gut's abyss, I drink, I ride, I hope, I pray. May I arrive, not leak today." Even the Great Khan himself, according to a half-suspect account, preferred arag over wine. Not because it tasted better, it didn't, but because it was Mongol through and through. It came from the land, from the horses, and from a long line of people who understood that ruling an empire requires a strong stomach in more ways than one. Tonight, as the wind dances low across the grass and the stars begin to blink into view, somewhere out on the plain, a courier tips back his flask. It fizzes once softly. He smiles. So far, so good. At the edge of a windswept relay station, just a smudge of tents and smoke on the vast Mongol canvas, there sat a weathered bowl filled with what looked like chalk marbles. Hard white and slightly furry from exposure, they clinked softly when moved like the bones of some small and very forgettable animal. This was Arul's angrier cousin, kurut, a dried cheese ball with the texture of ceramic and the taste of a dare. Riders both loved and feared it. It lasted forever. It resisted mold. It could double as a projectile in times of banditry or boredom. But chew it wrong, and you'd swear off food entirely. To say kurut was tough is an understatement. It was a cheese born from desperation and hardened by wind. Mongol children learned to eat it the way others learned to sharpen knives, slowly, carefully, and with a respect usually reserved for wild animals or in-laws. Historians still argue about the precise ingredients of kurut. Some insist it was a blend of fermented milk from goats, sheep, and occasionally yaks, kneaded and pressed and sun-dried until it could bounce. Others suggest it was just whatever curdled nearby. Recipes varied from tribe to tribe, but the end product was always the same, round, white, dry, and immune to time itself. Some archaeological digs have found kurut so old it predated the surrounding pottery. Postal couriers carried these cheese orbs in leather pouches or wrapped in cloth. They were ideal for travel, lightweight filling, and largely indifferent to climate. You could drop one in a snowbank, lose it in the saddle, sit on it for an afternoon, and still expect it to taste, well, exactly as it always did, like a vaguely sour suggestion. Bold Bayar had 3 in his bag. He liked to suck on them slowly as he rode, though liked may be a strong word. It was more like a coping mechanism. The slow dissolve of kurut gave him something to focus on, besides saddle sores and the looming existential weight of delivering census documents to a man who refused to read. And yet there was something almost comforting about it, like the crunch of boots on gravel or the creak of old wood kurut was dependable. It reminded riders that even when everything else was falling apart, the scroll ink had run, the horse was limping, the soup had betrayed them. Again, cheese would endure. There's a story passed around campfires, probably invented by someone bored during a sandstorm, of a rider who once dropped his kurut into a river, chased it for 3 miles, retrieved it, and still ate it. No one doubts this happened. The real debate is whether the cheese softened. Opinion is split. The culinary applications of kurut were limited. Mostly it was eaten plain, but in certain well-stocked Urtu cooks might grate it into stews or dissolve it in water to create a sour broth. Imagine soup that fights back. There was also a rumored preparation where kurut was boiled, mashed, and formed into something resembling a dumpling, though this is widely regarded as a misuse of time and resources. Some writers developed personal techniques to make the cheese more palatable. One would bury it in hot sand to soften the edges. Another famously dipped it in arag and let it fizz until it achieved a jelly-like slop he called sky pudding. That man was later reassigned to the most remote outpost in the empire, possibly for reasons related to morale. Still, the cheese endured. It became a symbol not just of sustenance, but of the Mongol spirit. Hard, unyielding, a bit sour, but deeply reliable. Even those who grumbled about its texture, most writers carried it faithfully. There's a preserved fragment of an old courier's journal scratched onto birch bark that reads, "Fourth day. Wind fierce, horse worse, scroll intact, Kurut unchanged. Thank gods." Indeed, Kurut outlasted empires. Modern-day Mongolian herders still eat versions of it. And if you ever find yourself trekking through the Altai with nothing but a water flask and a borrowed pony, odds are someone will hand you a cheese ball that looks like it came from a museum and tell you it's food. And it is. Technically, one scholar who attempted to recreate ancient Kurut described the process as milking despair, curdling it with effort, and drying it under the sun until only resolve remained. His test batch broke a ceramic bowl and is now on display at a small university in Ulaanbaatar under the label "Not for Human Use." Yet to the Mongol couriers, this was more than cheese. It was a kind of edible oath, a declaration that no matter how hard the road, how cruel the weather, or how confusing the handwriting on the scrolls, they would keep going, because someone had to deliver the mail, and someone had to chew the cheese. As the wind howled outside the station, Bold Bear leaned back against a saddlebag, tossing a curd into the air and catching it again like a stone skipping across memory. He didn't need soft bread or sweet cakes. He had his horse, his scroll, his pouch of ancient dairy rocks. Dinner could wait, but the cheese would always be ready. The fire crackled low in the corner of the Urtu hut, sending thin trails of smoke up through the roof's smoke hole where it joined the ink-dark sky. 3 riders sat around the iron stew pot, legs crossed backs, bent, chewing on meat, with the weary rhythm of men who had stopped expecting variety. Bold Bear was among them, his beard glistening faintly with goat fat. Again. "Goat?" he muttered, peering into the pot, as though it might suddenly offer up something else. "Always goat." His companion, a beardless lad from the Khenti Mountains, shrugged. "Better than the time it was just water and bones. Maybe goat's a blessing." The third, an older man with a face like folded parchment, snorted. "That depends which part of the goat you're chewing. The truth is, goat was everywhere. Not just in the stew pot, but in the air, the bedding, the clothing, and somehow in the ink on the decrees. Mongol postal couriers lived in a world perpetually tinged with the scent and presence of goat. It was their blanket, their dinner, their enemy, and sometimes by the flickering light of the cooking fire, their conversation partner. Historians still argue whether goat or mutton was more common in yam relay stews. Official records barely distinguish between the two, lumping them under the catch-all term for meat. But ask any courier who had to fish around in a greasy pot with a carved wooden ladle, and they'd tell you the difference. Mutton was softer, richer, if occasionally too fatty. Goat, by contrast, was leaner, tougher, and far more likely to stare at you while being prepared. Relay station stew was never glamorous. It was, however, consistent. Each pot followed a familiar pattern, a bit of bone for flavor, hunks of meat, carved questionably, a few slivers of withered onion, if someone was feeling generous, and enough salt to wake the dead. Sometimes the stew would simmer for days, new ingredients added as old ones were fished out. There were whispered tales of one particular pot in the West that had never been emptied, only refilled since the days of Ogadei Khan. Bold Bayar poked at a piece of cartilage and sighed. "Somewhere," he said, "the Khan eats dumplings in a silver bowl. They all paused to imagine it. Not because they envied the Khan, but because the idea of a meal that didn't involve goat grease staining your fingers felt impossibly decadent. The Khan they'd heard dined on horse meat dumplings, steamed by 10 servants each more terrified than the last. There were rumors of sugar, even fruit flown in from far corners of the empire. Not that any of them had tasted fruit recently. One courier claimed to have seen a plum in Bukhara. It was later determined to be a rock. The difference between the food of rulers and riders was in many ways the difference between empire and reality. At the center, golden dishes. At the edges, stew and fatigue. Still, stew had its place. There was something about the way it clung to the ribs and warmed the belly, especially on long frozen rides. Riders learned to identify the best stews and the best stew makers by smell alone. A good relay cook was worth 10 horses and a full set of iron stirrups. Word of their recipes traveled nearly as fast as the royal orders. Some had secrets. One cook added dried wild garlic. Another dropped in 2 pebbles from a sacred river, claiming they helped circulate flavor. A particularly eccentric woman near Lake Baikal was said to hum to her stew. Not a song exactly, just a low melodic vibration that infused the broth with what she called stew wisdom. Her station became famous among couriers. Riders would delay their routes just to arrive at dinner time, but most of the time stew was stew. The same bubbling pot, the same shimmer of yellowish fat on top, the same slightly burned aftertaste that reminded you of every other night you'd ever eaten, while exhausted and vaguely resentful. There were accidents, too. One courier once tried to improve a stew by adding crushed kurut. The result was something between cement and betrayal. Another added spoiled arag for tang. No one spoke to him again. And then there was the time someone accidentally dropped a wax-sealed message scroll into the pot. They retrieved it quickly, dried it over the fire, and delivered it as if nothing had happened. The governor who received it claimed it smelled unusually savory and complimented the courier's attention to detail. Even the spoons had stories. Riders would carve their own, often from horn or wood, sometimes bone. These were personal items passed from courier to courier, whittled and worn down, until they fit the hand like a well-trained hawk. Losing a spoon was considered bad luck. Sharing one, unthinkable. Bold Bear's was dark wood, with a notch on the handle from where a goat had once tried to eat it. As he finished his stew and wiped his beard on the inside of his sleeve, there were no napkins in this world, only more layers. Bold Bear leaned back and stared into the fire. Tomorrow, he said, I'll eat something else. The old man chuckled. Tomorrow the goat gets you again. He probably would, but for now, with a full belly and warm feet, Bold Bear didn't mind so much, because on the steppe, comfort was rare, but Goat was always there. The stars above the steppe stretched endlessly, pinpricks of light scattered across a dome so wide it made even the bravest rider feel like a speck on a dusty scroll. Somewhere far from any city, nestled in the humblest of Urtu stations, a pot of stew bubbled gently while the couriers dozed. The fire crackled and the goat. Because, of course, there was a goat chewed solemnly on a saddle blanket. But not every meal in the Mongol Empire was boiled mystery. Somewhere, usually far from dust and desperation, sat a golden ladle unused, ceremonial, polished, and deeply unnecessary. It belonged to the Khan, or one of his many noble cousins, and it was rumored to have tasted soup exactly once before being placed forever on a velvet pillow for admiration and occasional theft attempts. You see, the further one climbed up the administrative yurt ladder of the Mongol Empire, the stranger and more delicate the food became. While the postal riders sucked on sour curds and dared each other to eat stew that had been reheated 6 times, the elite dined on dumplings. Dumplings. They weren't even a Mongol invention. The idea likely wandered in from China or Central Asia, tucked into the luggage of a conquered cook or eager courtier. But once discovered, the Mongol nobility adopted the dumpling with curious delight. Meat wrapped in dough steamed into a soft, fragrant pouch. It was portable, elegant, and didn't require a spoon that had recently been inside a horse. But what's truly strange is this: the higher up the chain you went, the less likely anyone was to eat their food. Meals at court were orchestrated affairs, steamed dishes laid out on golden trays, delicate confections made of milk sugar and pure political anxiety, stews so refined they barely contained any animal at all. Yet no one touched anything until the appropriate moment, which more often than not never arrived. Historians still argue whether Mongol nobles actually ate during court meals or merely observed the food as a display of power. There are documents from Persian emissaries describing rows of untouched dishes, each guarded by a servant whose job was to nod solemnly at the food. One Turkish ambassador wrote of a platter of lamb dumplings that circled the entire royal tent without a single bite taken, perhaps in fear of poisoning, or perhaps in sheer awe at the symmetry. Even the Khan himself, whether it was Genghis Ogadeh or Kublai, was sometimes said to nibble, only slightly more interested in inspecting the loyalty of his guests than the flavor of his broth. Meanwhile, the poor souls responsible for making these meals, dozens of cooks, stew masters, and dairy specialists, lived in a perpetual state of nervous exhaustion. One misstep could be interpreted as insult, treason, or culinary assault. A dumpling too salty might be seen as an omen. A burnt milk cake, grounds for exile. But down in the postal system, far from embroidered tents and court musicians, food had no time for metaphor. It had to be hot, edible, and fast, which is why stories like these infuriated the couriers. Boldbear once received a letter written on rice paper, luxurious, soft, and tragically fragile. Upon arrival at a station plagued by icy rain and a surplus of soup, the letter began to curl. He dried it near the fire. It flaked. He cursed it, wrapped it in his coat, and pressed on. By the time it reached its recipient, a rotund minor official, known mostly for wearing too many rings, it was torn in two and smelled unmistakably of goat stew. The official sniffed the letter with disdain and asked why it wasn't presented with the proper perfume. Boldbear stared at him blank-faced, then suggested he press the scroll between 2 dumplings if he wanted to preserve the scent. The official didn't laugh, but the goat standing nearby bleated approvingly. There were occasionally intersections between the worlds. A royal relative traveling incognito might pass through a dusty station complaining of cold stew and warm airag. They'd ask if the goat could be silenced. It couldn't. They'd demand dumplings. There weren't any. And so they'd sit glowering into the pot like it had personally insulted their family. And every now and then, a rumor would spread. A golden ladle stolen. A cook banished. A Khan who tried the postal stew and declared it unexpectedly honest. Whether any of these were true didn't matter. What mattered was that riders like Boldbear could sit by the fire gnawing on goat tendon and say, "You know the Khan eats like this now. Stew, just like ours." It wasn't true, but it felt good. As the fire burned low, Boldbear reached into his pouch and pulled out a shard of dried cheese, the last of his stash. He offered it to the goat, who sniffed it and walked away. Even the goat had standards. He chuckled and tossed the cheese into the flames. It hissed once, like a distant whisper of nobility. Then it vanished. The stew pot was empty. The night was cold, and somewhere out there, a dumpling sat, untouched, on a golden tray, waiting for a hand that never came. Morning on the step doesn't arrive gently. It barges in, uninvited, kicks the coals out of the fire and slaps you awake with a breeze that smells like grass horses and the quiet disapproval of the sun. Bold Bayer sat up, blinked at the horizon, and reached instinctively for the stew pot. It was still there. It was always there. He gave it a stir with his spoon. The stew had thickened overnight into something less liquid and more contemplative. The remaining fat had congealed on the surface into a map of rivers no longer relevant, and the chunks of meat, if they could still be called, that now resembled ancient artifacts awaiting excavation. He took a bite anyway. Of course he did. It tasted like regret. Not dramatic, soul-wrenching regret. Just the mild, papery sort you get from eating the same meal 8 days in a row. Which he had. The taste was somewhere between boiled belt leather and a whisper of goat. The texture, meanwhile, hovered in that strange middle zone, between stew and paste, stubborn enough to require chewing, yet somehow unwilling to commit to being food, and yet it filled the belly, which at this point in the yam system was the only metric that mattered. Historians still argue whether the food served at these remote relay stations was genuinely nourishing or simply designed to prevent collapse. Some archaeological findings suggest that many Urtu stews were made from whatever hadn't yet run away: bones, roots, bits of moss, and the occasional bird that had landed at the wrong time. Others claim there was a formula too: parts meat, one part something vaguely vegetable, all boiled until edible or surrendered. But the stew that morning, it wasn't following any formula. It had become something else entirely. A flavor so familiar, it had begun to lose meaning. Boldbeyer chewed slowly, as though hoping that maybe, just maybe, the next bite would surprise him. It did not. The spoon, once a proud tool of civilization, had also seen better days. Carved from birch and stained by 100 pots, it bore teeth marks from both humans and once a curious marmot. Its handle was chipped, its bowl warped, but it fit Boldbeyer's hand the way an old argument fits a marriage. Comfortably irritating. Nearby, a younger rider approached the pot, sniffed it, and recoiled. Did something die in that Boldbeyer nodded? Several things, I think. Some more than once. They ate in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because it was simply too early to have feelings about stew. The relay station itself was little more than a few yurts, stitched together with wind and ambition. The cook had already gone back to bed. The goat was asleep on a pile of scrolls. And the stew simmered on, indifferent to opinion, reputation, or palate. There was a time Boldbeyer remembered when he dreamed of better food. He'd imagined roast duck, sweet rice, maybe a tart apple. But years on the road had whittled down his expectations until even a warm broth felt like a win. A stew that didn't taste faintly of despair. Luxury, one without bones, a miracle. He took another bite. It tasted marginally less terrible than the last. This, too, was progress. Of course, stew wasn't always bad. In richer stations closer to trade routes or important cities, cooks had access to better ingredients. Spices, actual vegetables, things that crunched or sang, or did something other than slump. But out here in the ragged ribs of the empire, you learned to eat what was available. and then you learn to lower your standards again. There's a well-known courier's proverb: don't ask what's in the pot unless you're willing to sleep outside. It's sound advice. Curiosity, especially where food is concerned, is rarely rewarded. Some stew had ingredients best left unnamed things with too many legs or too few, or an unsettling number of eyes. There was a tale, possibly exaggerated, of a stew that included a small scroll by accident. The writer who consumed it reportedly became very eloquent for 2 days, then suddenly forgot how to blink. Yet stew remained the beating, burbling heart of the postal system. It greeted the riders at each stop, waited patiently while they scribbled notes, stood vigil as they mended saddles, and offered its bland embrace when all other comforts had ridden off with someone else. There's something oddly touching about it. The stew didn't need to be good. It just needed to be there. It was in its own clumsy way a promise you made it. You arrived. You lived through the wind, the wolves, the scrolls that never stayed dry. Sit, eat, tomorrow will be worse. And in that it offered something stronger than taste consistency. As the riders packed their things, Bold Bayer took one last scoop and slurped it down. He grimaced. He smiled. He stood. The stew watched him go, bubbling softly. And perhaps it tasted a little like home. There's a certain kind of madness that comes from living too long with stew. Not the bubbling, fragrant kind, served in stone bowls with sprigs of parsley and someone humming in the kitchen. And we're talking about the kind ladled out in tin pots, thick with indecision and just barely edible. The kind of stew that stains your fingers, your clothes, and eventually your soul. Bold Bayer knew this madness well, and on one particularly strange morning, it arrived wrapped in parchment. He had been on the road for 6 days straight, delivering scrolls to a particularly fussy tax collector in the foothills of the Kongai. The man had a fondness for wax seals and an allergy to common sense, which meant the messages were long, the routes winding, and the urgency entirely invented. Now, with sore knees and a growling stomach, Bold Bayer arrived at a halfway station, a crooked yurt, a suspicious pot, and a cook who looked like he'd lost an argument with a spoon. Stew, the cook offered. Bold Bayer grunted, tied up his horse, and took a seat near the fire. The pot was already boiling, and the smell... well, it was stew. Probably. Maybe. As the cook stirred, a puff of wax bobbed to the surface. Bold Bayer blinked. Is that the cook fished it out, holding the soggy clump aloft like a drowned bird? Embedded in the paste was half a seal red, broken and unmistakably official. Ah, he said, peering at it. Another message must have fallen in. Another, which meant this had happened before. Apparently, at some point in the night, one of the junior couriers had been careless with a satchel. A bundle of scrolls had slipped free and tumbled into the pot unnoticed in the darkness, and by morning had dissolved into a flavorful slurry of parchment, royal ink, and meat. Bold Bayer stared at the pot. The stew burbled innocently, offering no apology. Historians still argue whether such incidents were common or just the stuff of campfire jokes. There's no formal record of scroll stew in the archives of the Yam administration. But oral histories, those gently unreliable, gloriously embellished tales, tell of more than one time when a message was eaten both figuratively and literally. Paper, after all, was rare. Most Mongol messages were written on bark cloth or thin slivers of wood. But now and then, especially when dealing with foreign emissaries or official court business, true parchment was used. And parchment soft, absorbent, disturbingly stew-friendly, did not always survive the ride. Some riders admitted sheepishly to having consumed portions of letters in moments of hunger. Others claimed that ingesting the words of the Khan granted temporary wisdom. One man, having accidentally eaten a section of land redistribution policy, reportedly began to quote it word for word for 3 days straight before reverting to normal and demanding soup. Bold Bayar was not one for superstitions. He believed in what worked: strong horses, warm food, and not trusting anything that fizzed unexpectedly. But as he ladled the stew into his wooden bowl, he did pause for a moment, watching the way a scrap of wax floated past like a tiny red raft on a sea of fat. "Does it change the flavor?" he asked. The cook shrugged. "Adds authority." And so Bold Bayar ate each bite tinged with the faint taste of ink and bureaucracy. Later that evening, another courier arrived, a flustered youth with soot in his hair and panic in his eyes. He asked desperately if anyone had seen a missing dispatch regarding garrison rotations in the southern steppe. Bold Bayar nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I've seen it." He patted his stomach. The youth turned pale. In the following weeks, this incident became legend. Riders began joking about digesting policy, internalizing orders, and the risk of overseasoned legislation. A cook near the Irtish River even decorated his stew pot with tiny fake scrolls dangling from string. He called it commander's broth. No one asked for seconds. But not all stew scroll interactions were accidents. There's one tale, almost certainly false, of a courier who, upon discovering that he had been given a politically dangerous message, ate it on purpose. It was said to contain orders for a surprise raid on a local tribe with whom the rider's family had long-standing ties. Faced with loyalty to the Khan or loyalty to blood, he chose option 3 stew. They say he added spices to mask the ink through in extra onions to ensure total obliteration, and slurped the message down with dignity. When questioned, he claimed the letter had been lost in a river. When pressed, he blamed a goat, and the goat, for once, got away clean. In this vast empire of sand and sky where words traveled faster than intentions, and meals often came with moral dilemmas, it wasn't just scrolls that got swallowed. It was history, pride, and on the rarest occasions, regret. As Bold Bayar wiped the last streak of broth from his bowl, he reflected on the unusual flavor. Not bad, he thought. Little chewy, slightly declarative. He burped softly. Somewhere perhaps a scribe felt it, and in the pot the stew simmered, on unbothered, unapologetic, and utterly sovereign. If you'd stepped into a Mongol Postal relay station in the dead of night wrapped in fog and the occasional bleat, you might not have known immediately that you were entering one of the most essential nodes in an empire that spanned the known world. You'd probably notice the smell first, a heady mix of sweat, smoke, wool, goat, and something vaguely sour that could be milk or soup or politics. Then you'd see the yurt itself, circular, sloped, sturdy, inside a fire crackling low. Around it, riders sprawled like tired cats' coats, flung half-open boots, steaming faintly in the corner, and near the entrance, always the stew pot, simmering, judging. This was the culinary nerve center of the yam system. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't orderly, but it worked. The Urtu cooks, some assigned, some simply the least bad at burning meat, had the impossible task of feeding a constant stream of couriers who were always arriving, tired, impatient, and mildly offended by whatever the last station had served. A proper relay station had 2 or 3 staff, at minimum 1 to care for horses, 1 to manage the incoming scrolls, and 1 to handle food. Sometimes that last role was filled by a man who used his belt knife to stir soup. Other times, it was an elderly woman who could silence a rider's complaints with a ladle alone, the food predictable. Always meat-based, always hot or recently hot, and always tinted with the taste of the yurt itself, smoke, wool, and whatever had fallen into the pot that day. Yet within these humble walls, something remarkable happened. The yurt became a kitchen, a dining hall, and an unofficial diplomatic chamber all in one. Riders from different provinces, some fresh from the frozen north, others sunburned from desert winds, would sit together over the same bubbling pot, scooping meat and slurping broth with identical tired sighs. And the food, bland as it was, became a kind of glue. Historians still argue about the nutritional value of the meals served in postal yurts. Some say they were balanced for endurance, a steady stream of protein salt, and fermented dairy. Others argue they were more about morale than digestion. What is certain is that most recipes included at least one of the following: goat mutton sour milk, onions dried curds, or something that looked like a mushroom but wasn't. The meals were prepared with whatever the station had: supplies from local herders, barter from passing traders, leftovers from nobility with suspect generosity. There was no menu, only instinct and fire. One recovered account from a scribe stationed along the yam route described a stew so thin it apologized for itself, served with cheese that could double as sling ammunition. Another wrote of a miraculous evening when a cook served dumplings so soft they felt like betrayal, and the entire relay crew wept quietly into their bowls. Still, there was comfort in the ritual. Arrive, feed the horse, remove your boots unless you wanted to sleep alone, sit near the pot, wait your turn, eat what was given, complain just enough to remain likable. There were quirks, too. Each station had its own rhythm. Some began dinner with silence, others with toasts. One station in the east required every courier to tell a brief story while the stew simmered to add flavor, they claimed. Another insisted that the oldest present choose the first piece of meat, unless of course the goat was still awake and looking territorial. Then there were the superstitions. Many believed the stew absorbed energy, that a poorly stirred pot led to poor weather, that dropping your spoon in the pot meant you'd be sent to the borderlands. One courier famously refused to eat from a pot stirred counterclockwise. When a cook tried to trick him by reversing the ladle mid-stir, the man threw his scrolls in the fire and claimed he'd been hexed. Bold Bayer, ever the realist, didn't care about direction ritual or even flavor. He cared about warmth. And in the heart of the yurt, as he cupped his hands around a bowl of steaming broth, he found it. Not just in the food, but in the quiet companionship of others who understood exactly what it meant to ride, hard eat fast and sleep light. The walls of the yurt were lined with scraps, faded cloaks, spare boots, half-mended saddles, and scrolls, always scrolls. Some resting on wooden slats, others tucked into corners far from the fire. The messages might be urgent, world-altering, but for a few brief hours they waited quiet like the stew, like the breath of riders too tired to talk. And the goat, because of course there was a goat, stood near the fire casting a long, smug shadow. No one knew whose goat it was. Some said it had always been there, traveling from station to station like a furry omen. Others said it belonged to a courier who forgot to reclaim it after a drunken nap, and now it simply refused to leave. Bold Bayar had seen the goat twice, in different places, wearing the same expression, a look that said, "I've seen the Empire's secrets, and they're all undercooked." The goat was in its own way part of the system, like the stew, like the smoke, like the unspoken understanding that while the roads were long and the scrolls many, there would always be, at journey's end, a fire, a bowl, and someone to grumble at. And for a brief moment between scrolls, between storms, between long silences in the saddle, that was enough. There is a kind of quiet horror that settles over a campfire when someone unwraps their preserved food and it moves, not dramatically, not with legs or protest, but with the subtle, shivering conviction of something that has been too well peaty long by someone way H. Bold Bear had faced many meals with grim resolve, but nothing quite like what he discovered in his rations near the Curlin River, a pickled lump of uncertain origin, wrapped in waxed leather and twine, labeled only as important. It was soft, but not soft like bread, soft like an apology someone. He squinted at it. It glistened. The fire hissed quietly nearby as though distancing itself from responsibility. The goat, yes, that goat again, gave a single disapproving snort and lay back down. And so naturally Bold Bayar bit into it. It was sour, very sour, with an undertone of bitterness that suggested it may have once aspired to be a vegetable, but got lost somewhere on the road to vinegar. He chewed thoughtfully. It fought back like bad news, wrapped in brine, but it was food in the loosest possible definition of the term. Historians still argue over what these pickled curiosities actually were. Some describe them as preserved gourds, used for long-haul travel dipped in strong fermented solutions that would prevent decay even during month-long journeys. Others think they were spiritual offerings, objects blessed by shamans to ward off bad spirits, then accidentally mistaken for food during particularly hungry moments. A few scholars, perhaps too optimistic, have floated the idea that these were early attempts at portable salad. Whatever their origin, they occasionally resurfaced in Mongol postal culture like edible rumors. There's one account, half faded, in the margins of a Persian merchant's travelogue of a relay station near Lake Zunbayan that kept a jar of pickled things buried beneath its threshold. The cook claimed it added protection to the stew. The writers claimed it added hallucinations. When one particularly brave courier ladled a piece into his bowl, he spent the next day insisting his horse had given him marriage advice. Even more infamous is the Ulan mystery, an object unearthed in the 1970s from a collapsed Urtu station by a team of archaeologists. Inside a sealed clay jar was a single shriveled leathery mass surrounded by cloudy liquid. Lab analysis confirmed it was once organic, possibly a root or small fruit, though no one could determine when or why it had been buried with such care. Theories ranged from medicine to military ration to a personal vendetta. One brave researcher reportedly tasted a sample purely for academic reasons and described the flavor as burnt lightning with notes of antique despair. He later switched fields and became a beekeeper. Back in Bold Bayar's time, however, there was no such luxury as lab analysis. If it didn't kill you within an hour, it was probably lunch. At some Urtu, preserved mystery foods were considered delicacies. They were traded between cooks, named like pets, and given ceremonial placement in stews on festival days. The older they were, the more prestige they carried, like wisdom or a limp. A cook once boasted of a pickled egg that had seen 4 khans and outlived 3 horses. No one dared eat it. It sat on a shelf, twitching gently in its brine, daring someone to blink. Yet in other stations, these pickled relics were treated with suspicion. There were stories of cursed jars of scrolls, lost after a writer insulted a gourd of stew pots that refused to boil when certain items were nearby. One Urtu near the Altai reportedly banned all bitter jars after a courier went temporarily blind from sniffing a particularly aggressive specimen. Still, the riders persisted, because on the road food wasn't about pleasure, it was about endurance. If it could survive freezing winds, baking sun, and the enthusiastic jostling of a galloping pony, then it deserved to be eaten, if only out of respect. Bold Bayar, for his part, finished the pickled lump in 3 bites. He followed it with a swig of areg, made a face that could curdle milk, and muttered a quiet prayer to whatever spirit had been watching over that meal for the last few decades. Later that evening, he shared the story around the fire. The younger riders listened in wide-eyed horror. One claimed he'd once eaten something similar. Only his had sprouted a small white tail. Another swore he'd seen a jar so potent it turned the stew blue for 3 days. The goat, overhearing this, got up, walked to the edge of camp, and stared silently into the darkness. No one followed. By morning, the pot was boiling again. The scrolls were packed, the horses were saddled, and somewhere in Bold Bayar's saddlebag was a second wax-wrapped object still untouched, labeled simply, "Do not open unless desperate." He tightened the flap. Not yet, but soon perhaps, because in the Mongol Empire hunger was never far behind, and neither were the pickled things that remembered. If you had asked Bold Bayar about the worst meal he ever ate on the yam root, he wouldn't have said it was the time the stew contained something that later blinked, or the time the cheese ball cracked a tooth that had survived 2 wars. No, he would have told you without hesitation about the day the goat cooked dinner. It started as most terrible stories do, with optimism. The station at Cook Noor was short-staffed. The cook had ridden off to find better onions and never returned. The firewood had been stolen by children from the next valley over who had promised to return it when the moon was full and our aunt stopped sneezing. And the stew pot, ancient, lopsided, and perpetually damp, sat cold and empty. Bold Bayar and 2 fellow riders, weary from long roads and longer conversations with bureaucrats, arrived with hopes of at least hot broth. Instead, they found silence, 1 half-dead onion, and a goat. The goat was not helpful. It was large, wiry, and full of spite. It had 1 ear, missing 3 teeth, too many, and a stare so intense it once made a grown courier drop a decree mid-sentence. No one knew where it came from. It had just always been there, haunting relay stations, from the northern borders to the southern sands, like a ghost that chewed things. And now, in the absence of any humans qualified or willing to cook, someone made the mistake of joking, "Well, let the goat do it." The goat, perhaps offended by the sarcasm, or perhaps merely seizing an opportunity, trotted over to the stew pot and promptly knocked over a saddlebag. Out rolled a dried hunk of meat, 2 withered tubers, and a pouch of preserved curds. The goat stared at them, looked at the riders, and began to chew. Whether it was divine coincidence or chaotic instinct, what followed was one of the strangest culinary efforts the Yam Network had ever witnessed. As the riders gathered firewood, mostly fence pieces and bad decisions, the goat trotted back and forth between the pot and the supplies, knocking things in, nudging embers with its hooves, and occasionally snorting at anything that didn't meet its mysterious standards. Bold Bayar returned to find the stew already boiling. The goat was stirring it with its head, not gracefully, not even effectively, but the water was moving, the ingredients were melting, and the smell, against all odds, was not entirely repulsive. They called it goat stew. Historians still argue about whether this actually happened, Some dismiss it as courier myth, a tired man's hallucination after a week of salted fish and political errands. Others point to several odd entries in the Koh Nur station logs: goat cooked, riders ate, no one died, followed by station goat, promoted to senior stew manager, refused duties, ate hat, whatever the truth the stew that night was. Memorable. It had depth. Not in a gourmet sense, there were no notes of coriander, no citrus zest. But there was something else: survival, mischief, and possibly hoof. It was chewy in places, crunchy in others, and the broth had a faint, smoky bitterness that tasted oddly like fence post. One of the writers claimed to detect a hint of scroll parchment. Another thought he saw the ghost of a potato. No one asked questions. They ate in silence, occasionally looking at the goat who had taken up a position near the fire, blinking smugly. Afterward, they sat back full in a way that was not entirely comforting. "Do we thank it?" asked the youngest rider, wiping stew from his chin. Bold Bayar considered. "Only if you wanted to do it again." The goat sneezed, then wandered off to chew on the yurt wall. The tale of the goat-cooked stew spread quickly. Riders recounted it in whispers over night fires, exaggerating details, debating whether the flavor leaned more toward clove or regret. Some refused to believe it. Others demanded the recipe. One cook attempted to recreate it by blindfolding himself and knocking ingredients into a pot at random. The result was banned in 3 provinces. From then on, whenever a stew tasted particularly odd, but not entirely bad, couriers would glance around and murmur, "Was this the goat's work?" The goat itself remained a mystery. Some say it moved from station to station, correcting bad stew with a swift kick to the pot. Others say it became immortal and now appears only to those in deepest culinary distress. A few even claim it founded a cooking school in a forgotten valley where it trains the desperate and the brave. But Bold Bayar knew better. As he rode out the next morning, stomach full, brain mildly buzzing from something unidentified in the broth, he glanced back at the station. The goat stood on the roof of the yurt, silhouetted by dawn, chewing on what might have once been an important message. He saluted, not out of respect, but out of wariness. You never knew when the goat might be watching or cooking. And in the saddlebag beside him, packed carefully beneath the scrolls, was a tightly wrapped ball of leftover stew. He would not be eating it. By the time a Mongol courier reached for his emergency rations, things had already gone wrong. Perhaps the Urtu station was burned. Perhaps the stew had betrayed him. Perhaps a goat had stolen his lunch for the 3rd time this month, and he simply lacked the emotional energy to contest it. Whatever the cause. When the fingers touched the small leather pouch, strapped tight beneath the saddle, just behind the knife, just above the bruised hip, it was never out of curiosity. It was out of survival. These were the true rations. Not the ceremonial dumplings reserved for governors, nor the bubbling pots traded in laughter at crowded stations. This was food designed to keep you alive and fundamentally unhappy. Food that didn't need to taste good, or taste at all. Inside the pouch, dried meat, usually horse, sometimes mutton, occasionally something that had once hissed. Salted into oblivion, it crackled like bark and required more jaw strength than most border skirmishes. Bold Bayar once chewed a strip for 3 hours and emerged with a mouth full of dust and a newfound respect for trees. Next came the dried curds, arul more aggressive than nourishing. Riders didn't eat them, they endured them. Little jagged teeth of dairy that could chip enamel and chip away at your will to live. But they were light, durable, and immune to both climate and logic. And last, always last, the secret weapon, dried fat. pure, unadorned, unapologetic, packed in wax cloth, often with a smear of herbs or garlic if the cook was feeling sentimental. This was the energy source, the fuel that kept your legs wrapped around the horse when your mind had wandered far into the realm of hypotheticals like, what if I became a monk? Or, what if I never deliver another scroll again and just live in this bush? Historians still argue whether there was an official yam-issued emergency ration kit. Some believe a standard set existed: meat curds, a handful of barley, maybe some pressed milk skin. Others think it was up to the individual rider to pack what they could afford or tolerate. There are records of some particularly wealthy couriers carrying tiny jars of spiced paste. There are also records of others drying old stew into jerky using sunlight wool, and what can only be described as willful denial. Either way, the point wasn't joy. It was motion, because you couldn't stop. That was the first rule of the yam. Letters didn't wait, decrees didn't linger. And the Khan he didn't care if your left boot was full of snow and your right eye hadn't blinked since yesterday. You moved. So the riders learned. They became surgeons of the ration pouch fingers, knowing the texture of each morsel without sight. They learned how to eat while riding, while shivering, while hiding in thickets from bandits. They learned how to suck on curds slowly, to trick the stomach, and how to swallow dried fat in silence when the wolves were close enough to hear chewing. There was a trick to rehydrating the meat if you had time. Tuck it into a wet rag, place it under the saddle for a few hours, and let the friction and warmth soften it into something approaching chewable. It often smelled like horse by the end, but so did everything else, including you. Bold Bear had his own method. He called it the 3-bite rule: 1 bite of meat, 2 bites of curd, then chase it with arag if it hadn't turned hostile. It didn't make the food better, but it gave the experience structure. And on the road, structure was hope in edible form. Of course, not all rations were edible. There's one infamous tale of a courier named Dorji who packed what he thought were pressed cakes of barley and goat milk, only to discover mid-journey that someone had swapped them with medicinal tree bark. He ate them anyway. He delivered his scrolls. And he spent the next week convinced that his horse could speak Latin. Others weren't so lucky. Moldy cheese, spoiled fat, arag gone from tart to sentient. A courier could brave blizzards and bandits, but a stomach in open rebellion, that was harder to outrun. Which is why some riders carried charms in their food pouches, not to bless the food, but to beg it not to turn. Tiny bones, knotted strings, a smooth stone passed down from a grandmother who'd once claimed it, whispered, "Don't eat that." Even Bold Bayar kept a coin, useless as currency, but polished smooth by time and fingers, and always nestled beside the curd. There's something poignant about it, really. These hard-edged men thundering across the continent, kings of the open land, and still they hoped their cheese wouldn't kill them. Still they whispered to the stew. Still they packed little tokens to hold off the belly demons. It was perhaps the most honest part of the Mongol postal system, because even beneath the banners and the scrolls and the snarling gallop of empire, every rider was just a hungry traveler trying not to die before dinner. And if you asked Bold Buyer, he'd say the emergency rations were terrible, truly, impressively terrible. But they worked, and that in the end was all that mattered. Somewhere between Kenti's dusty ridge and the first glimmer of the Onan River, Bold Buyer paused his ride to sniff his arag. It fizzed politely, which meant it was still safe, probably. He took a cautious sip and scanned the path ahead. Wind tugged at the edges of his coat. The sun blinked from behind thin clouds, and in the saddlebag at his hip, two scrolls rustled as if nervous about what came next. He wasn't worried about the weather or bandits or the steep ravine that someone once rode into while chasing a runaway goat. No, what weighed on his mind today was more personal. Had someone just tried to poison his stew? Historians don't often speak of food poisoning on the steppe. It doesn't show up in grand chronicles. There are no bronze plaques for the courier who spent 3 days hallucinating after a tainted dumpling. But if you ask the riders, those who knew the routes like their own bloodlines and could smell a sour broth at 50 paces, they'll tell you food was warfare. Not on purpose, usually. There were instances, of course, where things got intentional. A bitter feud between two station cooks in the eastern provinces once resulted in an entire pot of soup laced with something described in one report as aggressively laxative. The targeted courier managed to deliver his scrolls, but only by inventing a new method of riding that involved no sitting. Poison, in its many forms, was a real concern, not from assassins with vials, but from negligence wrought or malice disguised as seasoning. To prevent accidents, Yam riders developed a set of field-tested precautions. Bold Bear had learned them all from the old man who first trained him. Smell twice, sip once. Always eat after the goat has. If the stew bubbles in silence, it's fine. If it sings, leave immediately. Historians still argue whether Mongol riders carried anti-poison measures. Some say vinegar was common, used not only to clean wounds and settle stomachs, but also to counteract certain types of spoilage. Others mention sour milk as a folk remedy, believing its living bacteria fought off foodborne curses. One particularly wild theory suggests some couriers carried strips of silver, which they dipped into food as crude detectors. If it tarnished, the meal was suspect. If it didn't, well, the goat still got first dibs. And speaking of goats, there was one naturally involved in the most well-documented case of suspected food sabotage. It happened in the spring of 1254 during a brief but heated rivalry between two administrative branches, the Western Yam and the Southern Scroll Division. A courier, unnamed in the records but remembered in song, arrived at a disputed station and was offered stew by a cook who, according to later reports, smiled with too many teeth. The courier, suspicious, let his goat sniff the bowl. The goat sneezed, kicked the pot, and bolted into the night. The courier ate dried meat instead. The next day, two station clerks were found arguing over whether they had used too much of the powder. What powder, no one would say. But from that day on, the station was nicknamed Goat's Mercy, and all food served there came with a small wooden charm, depicting a hoof. Even without conspiracy, accidental poisoning was just part of the ride. Meat went bad, cheese went rogue. Arag could ferment twice, then ferment again out of spite. Couriers learned to detect the sign's green edges unexpected, fizzing the unmistakable smell of revenge. Bold Buyer on one occasion opened a ration pouch to find his curd crawling slightly. Not enough to panic, just enough to reconsider. He burned it without ceremony and ate snow for the afternoon. Some riders swore by rituals. Stir clockwise. Tap the spoon on the rim 3 times. Hold your breath before the first bite. These weren't culinary practices. They were survival spells. And they weren't always enough. One poor soul Ganbatar, if the story is to be believed, ate a tainted dumpling from a roadside merchant. He didn't die, but he lost all his hair, forgot the names of his children, and began reciting tax codes in verse. He was later appointed to a local office. Yet for all this, most riders pressed on. They had to. Trust was part of the job, trust in your horse, your station hosts, and sometimes in the bubbling stew that probably wouldn't end you. Bold Bayer carried a tiny pouch of dried herbs, sour root crushed mint, and something his mother had sworn was just in case. He never used it, but it sat at the bottom of his bag, quietly reminding him that the road cared very little about good intentions. That day as he rode, he pondered the stew from the last station. It had tasted strange, not bad, just oddly sweet, and the cook had been nervous, and the goat had sniffed, then wandered off, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like judgment. He'd be fine. He was probably fine. But just in case, he took a sip of vinegar from his flask and muttered a quick line, "Not today's soup." The wind answered with a low whistle. The scroll rustled in his bag, and in the distance a goat bleated once, long, low, and possibly sarcastic. Word count 1092, awaiting continue. Section 16. There is a sorrow to cold dumplings that only the lonely truly understand. Fresh from the pot, a dumpling can be a thing of hope, steaming soft with its meaty secrets, tucked inside like a well-written confession, but cold hours old and stuck in a pouch between a dispatch scroll and a lump of cheese that smells faintly of despair. Then it's just a folded apology wrapped in dough. Bold Bayer turned the dumpling in his hand. It had been given to him at the southern outpost of Yargate by a woman too busy to smile and too tired to lie. Left over from the governor's lunch, she had said, placing it carefully in a cloth and adding almost like a blessing, "Still good, probably." Bold Bayer had nodded. Couriers did not reject food. They accepted it like news from the gods, chewed, pondered, and never questioned out loud. He'd ridden for 2 days, with the dumpling tucked neatly beside his scrolls. Every few hours he'd think about eating it. But something always got in the way. Whether wolves, a particularly judgmental goat, or simply the quiet knowledge that once it was gone, it would be gone. And there was a strange comfort in knowing there was one meal still untouched, even if it was just starch regret and mystery meat. Historians still argue about whether dumplings were ever intended for the postal class. Some claim they were a noble delicacy, flavored with garlic ginger, or even dried apricot if you were lucky, and shared only on feast days. Others insist that riders received them all the time, usually cold, always late, and typically filled with the same 2 questions. What's in this, and why does it taste like boots? Bold Bayer didn't care for the arguments. He liked dumplings. Not for the taste, which was inconsistent at best, but because they reminded him of stillness, of kitchens, of places where things boiled slowly and people had time to fold dough instead of fleeing the wind. He finally sat down to eat it at dusk, beside a stream lined with thin trees that rustled like gossip. His horse drank upstream. The goat, yes, still following him, for reasons unknown, sniffed a patch of grass and lay down with a huff. Bold Bayer unwrapped the dumpling like a gift he didn't deserve. It was slightly dented, the dough a bit cracked, but it was whole. Still cool, still waiting. He bit in. It was dry. Too much flour, a hint of lamb, a whisper of onion, and the unmistakable taste of silence. But then halfway through the second bite, he noticed the paper. Folded beneath the dumpling, tucked gently into the wrapping cloth, was a letter, small, neat, and sealed, not with wax, but with a pressed yellow flower. He blinked. Letters usually came stiff with orders, curses, taxes, or warnings. This one smelled faintly of herbs and looked like it had been handled with care. He opened it. "If you receive this, know you are not unseen." This world turns fast, and your hooves carry messages the rest of us barely deserve. I do not know your name, but I know the path you ride. If your road ever leads you near Saddlebag, find the willow stump by the hill. Leave a stone. I will wait. T. He read it again, then a third time. The fire cracked behind him. The wind shifted gentle now, as if softening to let him think. It wasn't signed with a full name, no explanation, no address. Just a note, tucked with a dumpling, from someone who understood that loneliness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's folded quietly into your dinner. Bold Bayar sat with the letter in his hand and the last half of the dumpling untouched. He wasn't a romantic. He was a courier, trained to ignore distractions, to cross rivers with scrolls in his teeth, to memorize the sound of distant hoofbeats better than his own birthday. But still, the words lingered. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars turned overhead, like ancient watchmen, he decided. At dawn he rode fast, not frantic, just steady, as if the earth itself wanted him to arrive. He reached Saddlebag by evening. The hill rose slow and silent behind the station, capped with soft grass and a single willow stump, long dead but still standing. He dismounted, approached. No one was there, but he knelt, took a smooth stone from the riverbed he'd crossed at midday, placed it gently on the stump, and left. No one spoke of it when he returned. No one asked. But the next week at a different station, he overheard a cook telling a story about a courier who'd passed through. A woman, quiet, sharp eyes, asked for a stone. She had smiled. From then on, Bold Bayar kept his eyes open. Not expectant, just open. He never met her. But sometimes when the road grew quiet, he found another stone on a stump, or a folded dumpling left on a flat rock warm inside. Once even a single pressed flower inside his saddlebag. No name, just presence. And it was enough. Riders began whispering of the legend, the Willow Watcher. The woman who sent dumplings like prayers and wrote notes that made grown men sigh into their broth. Some believed she was a spirit, others a former scribe who'd escaped paperwork and found poetry. But Bold Bayar knew the truth. She was someone who understood what it meant to ride, to carry the words of others without ever speaking your own. And she had chosen to speak once through a dumpling. He never ate another one without checking the wrapping first. He always left a stone. Theft on the steppe came in many forms. Some of it was dramatic raids, ambushes, the occasional cart tipped over in a blaze of arrows and curses. But most of it was quiet, subtle, the kind that left no tracks but took something vital, like stew. Postal riders could forgive many things. Missed horses, broken stirrups, a goat that stared into your soul. But steal a man's stew, that was war. Bold Bayar had left his pot simmering just for a moment. The fire was low, the wind gentle, and his horse for once not chewing anything important. He had stepped a few paces away to unroll a scroll and squint at a note scribbled in particularly belligerent ink. When he returned, the pot was empty. The steam still hung in the air like a question. And beside the pot, unmistakably smug, stood a goat. Bold Bayar stared. The goat blinked. It wasn't his goat. At least he didn't think it was. The goat seemed familiar in that way. All goats do like it had wronged you in a past life and was back to finish the job. Its beard was slightly askew, its hooves were muddy, and its breath smelled faintly of onions. You didn't? Bold Bayar whispered. The goat sneezed and trotted off. He sighed. Stew theft wasn't technically a crime, but among couriers, it was considered a moral failure an act of disrespect that ranked just below misquoting the Khan and slightly above sneezing on a scroll. Historians still argue whether the yam had official penalties for food theft. Some accounts mention public scolding. Others refer to stew thievery as grounds for punitive reassignment, meaning the thief would be sent to the most remote, wind-blasted, goat-infested Urtu in the known world. There's even a fragment from a legal scroll that reads, "Let no man take from another that which was cooked in patience and salted with hardship," which scholars agree is a poetic way to say, "Don't steal the soup." In Bold Bayer's case, vengeance came not through violence, but through bureaucracy. The very next day he arrived at a larger station, one with log books, ink pots, and a clerk who wore too many scarves for summer. Bold Bayer filed a complaint in detail, including a drawing of the goat. The clerk, who had once been a postal rider himself and still had a limp from a stew pot incident, nodded solemnly and added it to the station's ledger. Under crimes, the entry read, "Date 14th of the late wind offense, theft of mutton stew, suspect goat approx. 3 FT tall, 1 ear, malicious outcome, victim hungry. Goat not remorseful." But of course the goat was not the only thief. There were riders who hoarded spices, hiding pouches of garlic or wild onions in their saddle wrappings and refusing to share. Others diluted stew and took the thickest bits for themselves. One infamous courier name redacted in every scroll once added sand to a pot so he wouldn't have to split it evenly. The other riders found out. He was fed nothing but tea for 3 weeks, without leaves. Still, goats remained the most persistent culprits. They were fast, clever, and entirely without shame. At one station, a goat was caught with its head inside a pot, slurping broth with such ferocity that the cook mistook it for an angry spirit. When they tried to chase it off, it kicked over the fire and left behind a single scorched onion as a taunt. Bold Bayar's revenge came in the form of passive aggression. At the next Urtu, he cooked his stew high on a ledge, built a fence of firewood around it, and posted a crude sign that read, "Not for goats. Property of Bold Bayar. Steal this, and you are stew next." It didn't stop the goat, but it made him feel better. The real justice came weeks later when word reached the relay network that a certain goat, possibly the very same, had been recruited by a border cook near Karakoram. Recruited in this case meant chained gently to a post and kept just close enough to the stew pot to sniff but never taste. They called him the watch goat. He was trained to bleat if anyone touched the pot without permission. No one knew if he understood the assignment, but thefts dropped significantly. Some said it was because he had been reformed. Others claimed it was because he kicked like a siege engine. Bold Bayer passed through that station once months later. He saw the goat. The goat saw him. A long moment passed between them, neither forgiveness nor malice, just mutual recognition. "You remember," Bold Bayer said. The goat sneezed. He took that as a yes. Later that night, as stew bubbled over a clean flame and no thieves lingered nearby, Bold Bayer stirred slowly with his worn spoon. He wasn't angry anymore, just cautious. The way you are after someone eats your dinner and looks proud about it, because in the world of postal riders, your stew was more than food. It was time. It was effort. It was warmth, carved out of a cold road and worse company. And when someone took it, they weren't just stealing broth. They were stealing comfort. And out here, comfort was sacred. Word count 1098, awaiting continue. Banjanoi, continue Chat GPT Janoi. Section 18, there's a sound a stew makes when it's nearly ready, low, thick, and almost hopeful. It bubbles not like a boiling kettle, but more like a tired man settling into a warm bath. On the steppe where the wind howls and the horses mutter in their sleep, that sound meant everything was briefly okay. So naturally someone began singing to it. Not boldly, not with drums or the sharp rhythm of a war song. No, this was a hum, a barely there vibration of breath and memory. Boldbyre had first heard it from an old bard who rode between Urtu stations in the East trading poems for stew, and always carrying a cracked instrument that looked like it had seen better centuries. The bard's name was Erch, though some claimed that wasn't a name so much as a noise he made when sitting down too fast. He arrived at the fire one night, nodded to the pot, and began to hum. Nothing lyrical, no words, just a gentle looping melody that twisted in the smoke and settled into the broth like a seasoning no one could quite identify. Bold Bayar raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" "Singing to it," Erk replied without stopping, "so it doesn't turn." "You think the stew listens?" The bard tapped his spoon against the rim. "I know it does. Stew's like a horse. Spook it wrong and it'll bite you back." Historians still argue whether this practice singing to the stew was widespread or just one man's elaborate excuse to participate without chopping onions. Some believe it was rooted in older shamanic traditions, when music was used to bless food, fire, and fermentation. Others scoff, pointing out that stew, regardless of melody, still burns if you don't stir it. But the idea caught on. Within a month, riders at 2 more stations were humming over their pots. The melodies varied, some solemn, some playful one, suspiciously similar to a Bodhi drinking song about a tax collector and a goose. Regardless, the food reportedly improved, or at least people complained less. Boldbyre remained skeptical until the night he forgot. He was tired. The scroll had been heavy. The river crossing had been deeper than expected. And the stew, it stuck, burned, not entirely. Just enough to leave a bitter crust at the bottom and an aftertaste that whispered, "You failed me." He remembered Erk's words. The stew knows, it remembers. So the next evening he tried. Not a song, not really. Just a hum, low, tuneless, maybe off-key, but earnest. He stirred as he hummed, and the broth turned smoother. The smell rose richer. Even the goat stopped glaring for once. After that, it became habit. There were other songs, too, some handed down, some made up on the spot. One courier near the dunes of Zavkhan swore by a 3-note chant he claimed made goat meat taste like lamb. Another insisted on whistling while cooking, though no one could prove it worked because he always burned the bottom anyway. The stew didn't mind. Or maybe it did. It never said. There's even a legend tucked into the corner of a scroll, found in a ruined station about a stew that wouldn't boil until someone sang the birth song of the Khan. The cook, unable to remember the lyrics, allegedly hummed the only tune he knew, a lullaby about yaks. The stew boiled anyway. To this day, some writers believe that if your stew tastes flat, you forgot to sing. It wasn't about superstition, really, or magic. It was about attention. Singing meant you were there beside the fire, stirring with care. On the road where meals were usually mechanical and eaten one-handed on a galloping horse, this was rare. To cook and hum and wait meant claiming a moment for yourself, for the food, for the quiet. Boldbyre found he looked forward to those moments, even on hard days, even when the scrolls were damp or the wind cut through his coat. He'd set his pot down, light a fire, and hum. Some nights, others joined in. He once shared a station with 3 riders from different provinces. They didn't know each other's names, but when the stew boiled, they each began their own soft melody, one deep, one fast, one offbeat, and probably accidental. The result was messy and beautiful. The stew turned out perfectly, not sweet, not fancy, but right, the kind of right that makes you close your eyes while chewing and forget briefly how long the road has been. The goat, as usual, pretended not to care, but it didn't try to steal any that night. Eric eventually disappeared as bards do. Some said he rode west to find a stew that could sing back. Others claimed he opened a tavern where the menu had no prices, only melodies. No one knew for sure. But his tune lingered in fires. Across the empire passed, from ladle to ladle, spoon to spoon. Boldbyre still hummed it. Because some songs aren't for performance, they're for survival. And some stews, when listened to carefully, hum back. It was supposed to be a routine delivery, just a short ride from one dusty outpost to a slightly less dusty outpost along a path well worn by hooves and habit. Boldbyre had done it dozens of times. The terrain was forgiving, the weather kind, the scrolls not particularly seditious. But fate, as it often did on the steppe, was in a pickled mood. It began with the radishes. He'd picked them up as a gift, bright red-skinned and soaked in a brine so aggressive it could have passed for battlefield strategy. A kind widow at the last urtu had handed them over with a wink and a whispered, "From my cousin's cellar." He swears they make men brave and women reconsider. Boldbyre didn't particularly need courage, and his love life had all the velocity of a limping yak, but he took them anyway. They were rare, sharp, salty, and they paired well with cheese that tasted like remorse. He packed them carefully beside the scrolls. This would prove to be unwise. Historians still argue whether the Mongol Postal network had official rules about carrying food alongside imperial decrees. Some say scrolls and lunch were always separated by oilcloth or bark to avoid pickled misunderstandings. Others claim riders were trusted to know that diplomacy and brine should never mix. But accidents happen. Somewhere along the ride, one jar of radish leaked, just a little. A fine drizzle of vinegar and spice soaked into the corner of a message bound for a minor princess stationed at the border. Boldbyre didn't notice, not until the scroll was handed over, unrolled in her tent, and immediately caused offense, not because of its content, which was, in truth, a dull inventory of grain shipments, but because the scent had overpowered the room. "I smell treachery," she said, waving the scroll before her nose like a fan made of betrayal. One of her attendants sniffed. "Or Pickle's Highness." The resulting scandal, later known as the Brined Affront, sparked 3 days of diplomatic bickering, the abrupt reassignment of 2 cooks, and a formal investigation into culinary sabotage by postal incompetence. Boldbyre was summoned, questioned, and ultimately cleared, but only after he produced the half-eaten radish jar and recited from memory the exact contents of the scroll, which incidentally he remembered only because the scent had embedded itself so thoroughly in his nostrils that he could smell every paragraph. Afterward, new guidelines were introduced at certain stations. Scrolls and pickles must never share a pouch. Meat may mingle with messages only if wrapped in wax, and under no circumstances should anything containing garlic be transported near a princess. Ever again. Still, the story stuck. Riders joked that if you were late, you could always blame the radishes, or if your scroll arrived wrinkled, you could say it had brined itself in sorrow. Some began gifting pickled vegetables with passive-aggressive notes to sweeten your judgment, or at least distract it. Bold Bayar, for his part, kept his remaining radishes, not out of pride, but out of stubbornness. He developed a taste for them, sharp, sour, and slightly rebellious, a snack for those who rode alone and preferred their food like their politics bitey and not afraid to burn bridges. He did, however, separate them from his scrolls with a double layer of goat hide, once burned, twice pickled. But the incident raised a deeper truth one couriers knew well but rarely said aloud. The line between sustenance and scandal was razor thin. A stew too spicy could spark accusations. A cheese too old could be seen as insult. A scroll that smelled faintly of salted plum might trigger memories best left uneaten. There was a reason the Khan's personal messages were often carried by couriers who fasted during transit. No food, no accidents, no unexpected vinegar. And yet the idea that food and message should never mix, it was a fantasy. On the road, everything mixed. Sweat with ink, dust with soup, longing with leftovers, and sometimes even love letters arrived smelling faintly of fish. Because to be a courier wasn't just to carry words, it was to carry the world as it was. Messy, soggy, delicious, dangerous. Later that season, Bold Bayar passed through a different station one far from the scandal. A young rider offered him a small gift, a jar of bright pink turnips soaked in sour plum and mystery. He hesitated, then took it, because flavor like fate doesn't wait, and scrolls like princes would just have to deal. Even the mightiest empires grow quiet at dusk. As the sun slipped behind the distant curve of the Altai, the steppe exhaled, the wind softened, the horses dozed in their lines, and the stew, yes, still gently bubbling in a wide soot-blackened pot, released one last sleepy burble before settling into a satisfied simmer. Bold Bayar sat beside it, legs crossed, spoon resting loosely in his palm. He wasn't hungry anymore, not really. But he couldn't bring himself to move just yet. The road was behind him. The scrolls were delivered. And for the first time in weeks, he had nothing to carry but breath. All around him the relay station quieted like an old song coming to its final note. The fire popped once. The goat, a little slower these days, curled itself beside the coals, emitting a low grunt that might have meant contentment or mild disapproval. It was hard to tell. Goats were rarely in the mood to clarify. The last spoonful of stew remained in the pot. Historians, bless their parchment-dusted hearts, rarely write about the final meals of couriers. They speak of battles, treaties, the movement of banners and borders. But they forget this. Most of empire wasn't conquest. It was continuation. The slow, steady rhythm of men like Bold Bayar moving ink and ideas from one fire to another. And so it mattered, this spoonful, not for its ingredients, which were unremarkable. Bits of goat, a lonely potato, a sprig of something greenish that had clung to life longer than expected, but for what it marked an ending. A moment suspended between one duty and the next. Bold Bayar stirred it once absent-mindedly, then ate it, slowly, eyes half closed. No rush, because in the silence after journeys there's a particular peace, not celebration, not triumph, just stillness, the kind that only comes when you've ridden too far to remember the start and far enough that you no longer need to. He looked around the yurt. The walls flickered with firelight. The familiar smells of leather, wool, ash, and broth mingled like an old lullaby. Nearby, a younger courier poked his stew. "It's better tonight," he said. Bold Bayar nodded. "You sang to it." The boy looked sheepish. "A little, that's enough." Outside, the stars emerged one by one like messengers of their own kind, ancient, glowing, always moving. Somewhere a horse shifted, an owl called, and the goat snored, gently drool, pooling beside a ladle it had clearly claimed for itself. Boldbuyer leaned back, head against the yurt pole. He had no plans for tomorrow. The scrolls would come when they came. For now he let himself exhale fully, finally. And though no one saw, he smiled. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in the writing or the message or the stew that didn't burn. It's in the moment when you realize you've made it. Just here. Just now. The fire dims now, a hush, falling over the little station. The goat is asleep, still guarding the empty pot, with a kind of sacred laziness. Outside the night stretches wide and patient, draping over the steppe like an old wool blanket. You can hear the slow creak of wood, the faint rustle of grass, and the breath of horses steady, deep, safe. The last spoon has been set down. The scrolls have all been delivered. No one is waiting. Nothing is pressing. The road for once can wait. So let the warmth of the stew stay in your bones. Let the softness of the night carry you. Let the flicker of firelight play across your closed eyelids like an old song you almost remember. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.